the overall size in terms of our GDP. But we are the 145th in per capita income. Okay? So that immediately tells you what our real position is, because it's not GDP aggregate that's important, but it is more what is everybody is earning. Okay? So it's not also, per capita income also is not the true metric of assessing development, because there's a wide distribution of income. And as you know, income distribution in India is widely skewed. So the poor actually are much poorer than the average, much poorer than the average. Okay? So other matrices are required. So people try to develop better matrices which reflects development. And in the 1990s, you are probably aware, the Human Development Index was developed by none other than Professor Sen and Mahbubul Haq. And it was adopted by UNDP. It had 3 indicators: life expectancy, the mean years of schooling, and GDP growth. Just 3 indicators. But again, these 3 indicators combined into one does not show the total picture. So there are obviously many problems with that. So other indicator-based indices were developed, like the multi-dimensional poverty index, which has 10 indicators, developed by UNDP in 2010. And then thereafter, the Millennium Development Goals came up in 2000, which reflected 10 major goals of development. But again, people thought that it was too focused on the social side. And finally, the Sustainable Development Goals have come up, which I think are a big advance over the Millennium Development Goals, which came up in 2015. And this covers 17 goals and more than 200 indicators, all right? So if you are talking of development, you must see where India or other countries are with respect to all of these goals and these indicators, okay? So I did an exercise last year to assess India's progress on the SDGs, all right? So the World Bank has about 41 indicators which can be tracked across all the countries. And taking those indicators into account, I tried to see where India is vis-a-vis the world average and where India is as far as the East Asia Pacific average is concerned. And then if you look at these two, then I made a chart. This is published last year in the Economic and Political Weekly. You can see that of the 41 indicators, in the case of 19, India is worse than both the world average as well as the East Asia and Pacific average. In the case of 13 of these 41 indicators, India is worse than at least one. And it's only 9 that India is better than both. Our overall performance is pretty dismal compared to the world in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, which you can now consider are the basic metrics that must be used for measuring development. Now, I also did an exercise to see how we are likely to be in 2030, given current trends. How many of these SDGs are likely to be achieved? Again, India will fail to achieve 25 of the 41 indicators by 2030, given current trends. Which means what? Which means that we must do very much more than business as usual if we are to actually try and achieve the SDGs, okay? And reach up to some level of development. So we have a huge task before us. I've used that as a background to try and assess the budget that was presented yesterday, okay? Now, again, as I said, looked at one table, which is the expenditure table. And what I try to do is, see, if you look at the expenditure numbers, again, you can't make out, because, see, an increase will obviously take place, but then it's not increase in the current prices does not make much sense, because you have to deflate by the inflation, okay, to get real prices. But a better indicator would be if you divide the expenditures by the GDP. Then you get, or divide by the total expenditures. So I did two things. I divided each of these major heads of expenditures by the total expenditure. So that shows the allocation of expenditure and see over the years what has been done. And then I looked at the share in GDP. Now, this is the result. The areas where India has allocated more or is likely to allocate more, looks like allocating more, is in one, education, which is very good, which is a very, very important area. The other is social welfare. Again, welfare of people who are backward, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and so on and so forth, very important. But the most important increase is in infrastructure, that you all know, CapEx. Government is emphasizing hugely on areas like roads, bridges, ports, railways, and so on and so forth. So this is the philosophy of the government, basically, that if you bring in a large amount of capital expenditures on infrastructure, there'll be a huge amount of growth and so on. But what about the SDGs? The SDGs are in areas such as agriculture. Now, agriculture is the largest employer in the country, and the area which employs the largest number of the poor. Most of the poor in India are in agriculture, okay? And as you know, there's hardly been any development in agriculture. Agriculture is in some kind of crisis. So we would have expected, now all governments actually have neglected agriculture in India. We would have expected there would be some major increase in the agriculture side, but actually what has happened is, as far as percentage in total expenditure is concerned, in 2021, it was 5.24% of the total expenditures. And in the budget for 23-24, it is 5.20. Okay, so it is actually agriculture is falling. Sorry, pension, that was pension. Agriculture was 2.02 in 2021. It has fallen to 1.82 in 22-23. It's a very major drop. PM Kisan, 1.76 to 1.43. Commerce and industry from 1.24 to 0.90. Development of Northeast remains the same, 0.07. Health, which again is an area of crisis, fallen from 2.22 to 1.85. Rural development, where a very large chunk of it is in terms of the Manrega. That has fallen from 6.03 to 5.81. Urban development has also fallen from 2.82 to 1.78. Similarly, these areas which should have been emphasized and which are critical for the sustainable development goals, where we saw India is not doing well and where a radical increase is required in terms of resources and so on, that doesn't seem to be emphasized. That's also reflected in the demand for grants of individual ministries. For example, my colleague from MSMEs is here. Ministry of MSMEs, percentage of total expenditures 2021-22, 0.39. It has fallen to 0.37. Women remains the same, women and child development. Minority affairs fallen from 0.11 to 0.06, almost half. Law and justice, we know the courts got huge backlogs. If you file a case today, you will not be heard till 10 years later. 0.11 in 2021, the revised estimates for 22-23, 0.08. Okay. So this is how I think one should look at the budget. Try and see what are the values in terms of the total expenditures and in terms of share in GNP. Another very interesting fact, tax over GNI. We know that we must increase taxes. It's been a major problem to raise resources. 2021-22, tax over GNI was 11.6%. In 22-23, it fell to 11.4%. So while the philosophy of the budget is capex, what about human development? I think developing the human is as important as developing roads, bridges, infrastructure, power stations, and railways. And I think my overall conclusion is the budget should have emphasized much more